want to call your attention to the beginning of session 2 of the spring term of the St. John Academy for Theological Studies. We're very pleased that you all are here tonight and that you've been continually enrolling in each of our terms, this being the last term of this academic year. We'll resume again in October, November of the fall, 2019. I want to be sure that you have, if anyone doesn't or needs, an extra copy of the homework sheet that I gave out at the end of last session, so that you can, it's a process note pad that you can make your notes to each chapter as you're reading in the book and making notes, so that not next week, because we have reading week next week, but the following week we'll be coming back and we'll use this outline to kind of guide us through our discussion at that time and compare notes, so that, you know, somebody finds something in their reading that particularly is important to them, or is a point that they want to make, maybe something that I miss or somebody else misses, or somebody else says something that we miss. So together we'll be able to complete the worksheet and have a more complete overview of the material in the book. As I sent an email out today, so that if anybody didn't get that email, please see me at the break, and I'll see if we have any glitches in the address list. But if you read that email, I suggested that because the book is really, really terrific, that sometimes you need to read a chapter more than once, read it over again, because it's got so much material in it that is really, really appropriate to our discussion. And I think one of the real strengths of the book is that it has gleaned the wisdom of the ages and the other great religious traditions as well as our own. So although we know fairly well our own Christian traditions, to have an insight into Islam and the quotes of Muhammad, I think sometimes surprises of how really inspiring they are, because not being aware of the other religions, we don't realize how much wisdom there is in those traditions as well. And if you realize that the three great Western religions we are all children of Abraham, because Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came out of the same fertile milieu. And so there is a lot of overlap, similarity, and amplification within the three great religions that are very much complementary to each other. And then he even goes beyond that, as you know, and brings out the teachings of Buddha and the Tao and Confucius and so on. And again, as we're reading, we're just astounded, I think, if you are not familiar with them, of how wise these great seers of the East were, that we in the West sometimes have not had the exposure to understand. One of the terms we'll be teaching, the World Great Religions. We're going to be offering that, if not next year, 2019-20, in the following year. So we'll be touching on some of the great religions. Let's have a word of evening prayer, and Pastor Bill, would you offer our prayer for this evening?
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, we take this time to understand our church, our religion, our spirituality. Help us to open our eyes, our hearts, our minds, that we might be able to be connected with all ages. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 It's my distinct privilege to introduce you to Pastor Perkins, Anne-Marie Perkins, who's been a friend for many years.
Yeah.
And a good, we met actually last summer. We had met many times before that, but specifically we met at that wonderful place called Chautauqua.
It is.
And I happened to be walking down the brick road, and all of a sudden I hear a familiar and beautiful voice, and I turn around and there she is at Chautauqua. And so we had a wonderful chance to kind of meet again and talk. And I was thrilled when the possibility came up that she would be able to talk to us as a visiting guest lecturer here at the St. John Academy for Theological Studies. So we're thrilled that you're here. She's pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Warren, one of the great churches in our valley, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. That's a nice warm welcome. We don't get that as pastors when we get up and preach or lead worship, so it took me back. Wow. Let me give you a little bit of orientation to what I'm going to talk about, because it is very, very different than your book and your opening from last time you were together. My sabbatical that I took for the Lilly Foundation was last summer, and they had asked for a topic and quite a long proposal of what you would study and where you would go and so on. And so I started out to study intergenerational ministries and relationships, because it's important for us as church folk to recognize the different generations and how we interact and grow the church. And I quickly moved, well, not quickly, but over months, over a year, I moved through a lot of study about intergenerational ministry, and then focused in on spirituality and the different generations that have had different spiritual characteristics. And I'm talking about American spirituality, and I'm talking about Christian spirituality and beyond. My approach is not a world religion approach, as your book is, nor is it a practical approach. My approach is more a sociological and theological approach. Okay, so I'm going to, and even historical, you could say. So I'm going to give you a kind of a context in which we can look at the different changes that we've seen over the last 60 years, very broadly, and then focus in on spirituality in the youngest generation that we have coming up, what we can call iKids sometimes, or Generation Y, Generation X. Not Gen Xers, no, Generation Z. Generation Z or that's why I go with iKids, it's easier. So I want to start with asking you some questions, just to have you focus in on what you think spirituality means, so I can get a feel for where you're at with that word. Anything that comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality? You don't have to connect it to what you've been reading, but you're free to, of course.
A relationship with God.
Okay. What else?
Our relationship with others. You scared them all.
You keep
That
staring at me.
spirituality is, you know, for me is, it's a how-to also. I guess it's the how to communicate.
Okay.
With God.
Okay, right, right.
And
Is it easier to say what religion is?
Mhm.
I'm gonna ask you to tell me what religion is too. I'll put it on the other board.
Don't be shy.
Oh, yeah.
She's very understanding, so there's no wrong answers.
No, no, not at all.
Would religion be organized worship?
Okay. Yep. What else is religion?
Faiths and practices.
Organized worship. What did you say? Faith and practice?
Rights.
Rites. Okay. R-I-T-E-S. Practices.
Formal doctrines, a way of thinking about God. Which would be like systematic theology.
Yes. Way of thinking. Maybe systematically. About God. enough for a starter. I just wanted to get you thinking of the differences between the two of these, because that's where I'm headed in the beginning of my talk tonight. It's called Spirituality for All Ages because of wanting to bring in the different generational understandings of spirituality. It's not like a comprehensive over all the ages of mankind. It's more the ages, ages as in years, okay, people's years. I did this presentation at St. Paul, and I gave it the subtitle, Why We're Confident the Church Can Grow Stronger. There's been a shift away from religion, that's no surprise to you, a shift away from church, and many churches are wondering, how can we grow stronger? Can we grow stronger? And I think that part of the answer has to do with spirituality and how we understand it and how we practice it. Okay? I don't know if there are people here born before 1943. I'm guessing not too many if there are. That was the builder generation, or the great generation. And there are a number of those in our congregations, for sure. People that are the ones probably who formed the congregations, built the structures, and so on. And I don't mean to exclude them from my talk at all, but I want to focus on the boomers and the millennials. The boomers are the generation born 1943 to 1960, roughly. And this is the largest generation during the 20th century. 75 million people belong to the boomer generation. And I would guess that most here are boomers, as I myself am a boomer. And maybe we can relate to this, and it may be that our lens as boomers is more sympathetic toward boomers. So I want to try to expand your view and your thinking about spirituality and religion as we go along. So what happened from 1940 to 2000? So going from the beginning of when boomers were born right up until the year 2000. We've got different generations there. We've got the boomers, we've got the Gen Xers, and then millennials. Millennials were the last generation in the previous millennium. They were born 1980 to 2000. Okay, so there's 3 generations. And the Gen Xers, I'm not wanting to exclude those folks either in my conversation, but they're like sandwiched in between 2 very big generations, because the millennial generation is even bigger than the boomers. The millennials generation is 20% bigger. There are 83 million millennials in this country. We're talking about in our country. So the impact of the boomers and the millennials can be a very clear, certain kind of impact where we can see much going on there. Faithful Generations, where did I put my books? Faithful Generations by John R. Mabry is one of the books that I relied on to write my findings after I did all my research. And I'm going to send this around so you can take a look at it if you want to. I would highly recommend it, especially if you want to do more reading about the builders and the Gen Xers, or just to review, what you've heard here tonight about boomers and millennials. Here we go, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you.
He comes from the Christian ministry tradition. He's talking about all the generations from his lens of it as a minister. And that's where his research comes from. So boomers now are between 58 and 75 years old. And we are a transformational generation. The boomers came into the world as having a vision and a dream for how they wanted the world to be. And there were social movements like the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement that the boomers lent their energy to and their vision to. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Gloria Steinem were great leaders for these movements, and they questioned, authority. And so boomers responded to those questions coming from these figures, like, where do I go? Where do I fit in? Who do I follow? And so on. And so when it came to religion, you'll remember in the 60s, many denounced organized religion and said that, authority was out, so the church was out. Many opted out of that mainstream. And it was the beginning then of the so-called spiritual but not religious identity.
Right.
You've heard this before, I'm sure. We have shorthand for this, SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Because it wasn't called that at that time, but the boomers that were opting out of the mainstream of religion were in a broad spectrum of spiritual practices. If they were still following God and believing in spirituality, they were involved in meditation, prayer, worship, yoga, sacred texts, many of which you're going to be following in your book Essential Spirituality. You'll see many sacred texts in here that probably were explored by boomers back from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and so on. They also consider art, nature, poetry as entrance into spiritual life. And so the churches, the mainline churches, suddenly were starting to diminish because of this movement of spiritual but not religious. There was, however, a faithful remnant. We are all part of that remnant, and many more. And that faithful remnant had some of the characteristics of the boomer generation, right? They were into reformation. Let's change this church. Let's make it better. Let's do with authority what authority should be doing, whatever that is, and let's make action plans. Let's have mission statements for our churches. Does this sound familiar? We've done these things over the years, right? They came out of our culture where corporations were doing these things, and so we copied that. And it was about having values, mission statements and values for churches and communities. So this represents a big shift from the builder great generation. As we look at the boomers, the question comes up then, well, why is spirituality so significant today? Structures have loosened over the years. The social structures, the family, economics, community organizations, things have opened up and have loosened. Let me give you an example. If we're all from many different denominations here tonight, 5 or 6 different denominations, am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. In the 1950s, would we have all been sitting around these tables listening to a lecture together? No. That's an example of what has opened up and loosened up. So just where it gives us this kind of ecumenical cooperation and collaboration, we've also gotten some maybe negative impact of that loosening of structure. So is it too late for the church to grow younger? In other words, we've got this move with the boomers where there's been a diminishment of the mainline church and an opening into the spiritual but not religious, and now what? I believe, from what I've learned, that the millennials are the key to our future. They are the young people between 17 and 39 years old, or 18 and 39 years old, maybe your grandchildren or your friends of family and so on. They are now the largest generation in America, and they are not antithetical to religion at all. They just mostly, a lot, don't care too much about religion. That's no surprise to us either. And we'll go into that and why that is. Okay, let's talk about the millennials. They have positive relationships to their families and friends by and large. And I'm, of course, talking in generalities when I'm making all these statements about the generations. but they'll say that 90% of millennials have found their parents to have a positive impact on them. No generation gap there. 87% go to their parents for advice, they say. Okay? 94% greatly respect their elders. So there is really a bond and very little generation gap between millennials and boomers. And then the Gen X in between would go, you know, one way or the other, and where they identify. They also are technologically connected, right? These are the kids that grew up with phones and computers. From 1980s to 2000, there was at least an iPhone or a smartphone or a flip phone of some kind in the mix as they're growing up. Some kind of computer. If it was the first Radio Shack, what was the next? Commodore 64 or whatever, the Xbox. I mean, all of this just blew up in their lifetime. And they are so connected technologically. They value diversity, too. They are not myopic. If there's a difference around them, they embrace it. They don't expect everyone to be like I am. Everyone's different. Remember the TV shows they would have grown up with, like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers. If you think about those shows, they were all about, Sesame Street was about diversity.
Right.
And Mr. Rogers about, embracing who you are, and your values were to be, important. You're important. You're my neighbor. So then, as I mentioned before, as far as religion goes, millennials are mostly neutral about religion, not antagonistic to it. Now, that you may make it different with that. I can think, just as I've said it, that if you approach someone of a younger generation who is, say, spiritual but not religious in a certain way, they may feel antagonistic towards how you approach them. I've had that experience. Like, well, no, I don't want to go to church. That's not what I mean, though. What I mean is that there is a natural inclination towards God and the things of the Spirit within millennials. Okay? And in particular, it says on your sheet, moralistic therapeutic deism. I want to unwrap that just a little bit because millennials rely so much on themselves, and they can Google things to find out what they are, right? Moralistic therapeutic deism is a religion of the making of American millennials. It's arisen from their particular generation's mindset. Deism. God exists. They believe there is a God. 72% of millennials, I don't know if I've said this, are spiritual but not religious. So 3/4 of this generation believes this. God exists, and moral. It's moral because God wants people to be good and nice and fair to each other. And that's what's taught in the Bible. In their mind, it comes from the Bible, and so that they give it that authority. And then it's therapeutic because the goal of life is to be happy and feel good about yourself. God is mostly present when there is a problem to be solved, and good people will go to heaven when they die. So that's the general religious mindset of spiritual but not religious millennials. What does this really mean, spiritual but not religious? And this can connect to the definitions or the words we were coming up with when we were talking about spirituality and religion earlier, as we were starting the lecture tonight. And this is what I'm saying now in 2019. The difference between religion and spirituality can be looked at like this. Spirituality, an expansive, universal awareness of God or a higher being. And it is transmitted by the love of parents, family, higher power, or by God, Him, herself, itself. Religion, on the other hand, is belief in a religious figure or a set of teachings. And then we'll get into Christianity. See the difference in this, if you look in terms of the sociological development, the shift away from religion and into spirituality, this is what we get in our culture. Spirituality being that expansive, universal awareness of God, and religion a belief and practice of a set of teachings connected to a religious figure. I tried to gather information about Christianity in the studies I read, and it's very, very nebulous. The Pew Foundation says that 72% of our country is Christian, and 56% of those Christians belong to a denomination. On the other hand, the Public Religion Research Institute, which is another think tank with a very good reputation, says that only 42% of our country is Christian. So what I make of this, the difference between 42% and 72%, is that we've got a wide spectrum of beliefs, practices. Religion and spirituality is fluid and kind of get, mixed together. And so I don't want to try and say anything about the nature of the country, the religion of our country. So, if we started with a feeling of spiritual but not religious being a move away from religion and the practice of religion, and if we've invited folks to come to church or to practice Christianity with us, and they've said, no, I'm spiritual but not religious, we might have started to get a negative feeling about spiritual but not religious. I know I did. I even remember saying one time to my congregation, there's that movement in Warren, and they say, forget religion, get God. And they call themselves spiritual but not religious. And I had a little chip on my shoulder about that, because I didn't understand entirely what I do now, that there is a definite good element in this spiritual transition, this spiritual shift that we have in our country. We can take hold of it and understand it better and actually embrace it. There's a wide spectrum of spiritual and religious belief. I'm going to say this is so wide that we can include, on the one hand, the unbeliever, who may have values. Someone doesn't believe in God, they could still have values. They probably do. They could still hold love as primary in their relationships. Then there is, on that spectrum of spirituality and religion, a humanist who doesn't believe in God as much as in themselves. A humanist is one who will hold that they're responsible for their own destiny, and they would do good in the world and make the world a better place, and so on. And still, that has a good impact on our communities. And then, next along the line, the spiritual but not religious. So a move away from the less spiritual to the more religious. And we talked about spiritual but not religious being that they have private practices rather than engaging in organized religion. And yet they believe in God. And then to the religious practitioner, whether that would be Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, what have you. So, I just want to draw this line so that you're clear what I'm saying. There's the unbeliever, the humanist, the SBNR, and the religious. I got everybody? Spiritual but not religious is SBNR. Now hang on, because we're going to do something with this. So, I want to ask you some questions. What do you think would be common ground in these four categories of people? The unbeliever, the humanist, spiritual but not religious, and religious people. What could be common ground?
Belief in God.
Okay,
God.
belief in God. Well, you're unbeliever.
Yeah, I think they do. You gotta believe to not believe, or to say that you don't believe. To
Some
deny, you
degree. They may have some degree of belief.
Right.
Okay.
Belief in something.
Yeah, they don't
Some
believe
God,
in
higher
God.
power.
There's some, yeah.
The atheist.
Most of them have a belief in loving others,
Right.
moral values.
Their values.
Yeah.
Their values. would be
Moral
something
code.
that-
Okay, I heard somebody say values.
Yeah,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Moral values, that would be another common ground.
Mhm, mhm.
What else?
Love for others.
Oh, thank you.
Generosity. You know, there's so many in-between things that would fly both ways, especially love. If you love somebody and they're not especially a church person, and, you know, I've had to bury people like this, they said they were not spiritual, but you knew by their reputation in town that what they did,
Yeah.
that everybody knew that they were a loving, generous person.
Mhm.
And it's, you have to speak to the end of it, you know, trying to mix in a religious ceremony, but yet focusing on her love for children. She was a school teacher. And all the good things she did for kids, you know, bought them shoes when they were poor. These kind of things always are nice to bring out, and those are kind of the things she considered spirituality. She
Okay.
didn't consider, though, what was funny, that her kids grew up in the Methodist church, but she did not consider the United Methodist Church, you know, not her spiritual home. She had grew up in the regular Methodist church before it became the United Methodist Church. She did not consider that her home, but she did consider herself spiritual in the fact that she believed in God, but was not an attender periodically. Like she
Okay,
should
you've
be.
used the word 2 or 3 times. Spiritual values. We don't have that up here yet. You've got moral, but that's different than spiritual. Moral, I say, is right and wrong.
Mhm.
Spiritual is like compassion, justice, peace, and so generosity, and so on. Anything else you can think of? How about practices? Do you think people along this continuum, from unbeliever to religious people, all may engage in certain practices that would be spiritual practices?
Yeah, you could say practices in the sense that there are practices that are on the positive end, they're not practices on the bad side. You can have
Positive
bad-
practices.
You can have bad practices, and that would not be considered spiritual unless you're the devil or something. If you have good practices, like I mentioned earlier, that people, see that you are a good person, that you do practice what you're telling people, then those are the kind of things that goes into your spirituality.
Are you talking about group practices, or are you talking about individual practices, like you said?
Individual. I mean,
Well,
Individual, right?
Well,
Well, yeah, the practices is like, you go down the store, you give, let's say you give food to the poor, to the hungry pantry, you do other things that are more or less religious in nature. You do things that are common, good for the common good. Okay, not for something that's for me or individually
Well,
me.
if you start out as me, and you really believe that and practice it, as you go along that line, you're going to involve more and more people with you,
Right,
or you're gonna join them, so there's your continuum, yeah.
and that's part of her spirituality.
Uh-huh.
But what the lady I was concerned with, she did everything except she just did not attend church. And something happened, I could not get it out of her. She died a terrible death. She died of a slow stomach cancer. And I always saw her every Sunday afternoon and visited her. And, you know, I could never get out what happened with this link, what happened with the attendance of church.
Yeah,
But as far as trying to live a life, a good life, and spiritual life, I think she hit the button more than anybody. But she was not an attender.
right. So she dropped out from the mainstream at some point,
At some point, I
but
cannot
still
find out.
maintained her spiritual values, her
Oh,
moral
yes.
practices. Practices also would include things like reading, poetry, art,
Right.
meditation, prayer.
Yes.
Okay, there's no atheist in the foxhole, right? Prayer.
Right.
And the last question on page 2. What ways would you use to introduce our Christian religion to those without religion? And here I'm talking about the unbeliever, the humanist, and the spiritual but not religious. Those
By
without
example.
religion.
By example,
Okay,
personal
I ran
example.
out of space there, so I'm going to use the other board.
By listening to them and see what they have to say.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
If they are, well, like my daughter, she is very spiritual, but she is not into organized religion. She is dead set against it. So when we talk, she'll start, and she'll get to talking about the power of God and what He has done. So then we will expand on that without going into the religious aspect.
Okay, the listening is going to precede any kind of further relationship
Right,
and
'cause you
discussion.
have to hear where they're at first.
Absolutely. And I know you've gotten your evangelism training already in your head and in your,
Yes.
and in your heart. You've been working on that. What ways would you use to introduce Christian religion then, beyond listening? What would happen after that? What could you do?
Then you have to hold a conversation with them. In a, let's say, a gentle way,
Mm-hmm.
where you're not force feeding them, you're reaffirming their beliefs with your core beliefs. And at that point, you're showing them where you're at, they see where you're at, where you have been and where you're at now. So then it comes back to the example.
Mm-hmm.
Because they all go together. If you leave one out, you're gonna lose them.
Yes, they do.
Well, they always say actions speak louder than words. And so if they see the life that you are living is an example of a Christian,
How would they know that it's Christian? I want to push the question here. How would you introduce our Christian religion to those without religion? We've got a couple of generations who have not been in church.
Right.
And they may not have been introduced to the Christian religion in the way that we might want to do that. Pastor Bill?
Well, going back, listening to them and find out what are your values, what's important to you in your life. I think we can relate to that, whether it's building trusting relationships or being somebody that's dependable or somebody that's kind.
Mm-hmm.
We go, yes, that's my value too. Then, so you've established some common ground. Now you can say, I learned this from, or I am informed by my faith in these teachings on that particular, building trusting relationships, being someone that serves others.
The teachings of
Of
Jesus.
Christ, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, not the teachings of Bill.
I try to keep it.
No, because I agree, because if you try to talk to them without listening,
Yeah.
you could be forcing the wrong thing down their throat. And
Now, I want to interject here that if we're talking about particular people in our lives, and we've been in conversation, and we know, the listening, and we know the values and the expressions of morality and so on, that's one thing. If you're meeting someone brand new, and that you don't know their background.
What brought me over to fully believe that is when I was in Philadelphia and I went to St. Mark Lutheran Church, Pastor Chris started a thing where every Saturday he would take a bunch of us out and we go stand on the street corner downtown Philadelphia. I just listen to people, talk to them and listen to them without interjecting our thoughts at first.
At first, okay.
And then you learn to know them, then you know how to approach them.
Ask questions.
Ask questions.
I think there was one of the books where I was reading where it said, building that relationship and asking someone to come with you and just introducing them to Christianity. It takes one person. It's a one-on-one relationship. And if you tell one person and you trust in the Spirit to connect with them, within a month, everybody in the United States would know of Jesus. And there's so many that don't, but it's hard to, if one person just tells another, and then another tells another, it can, but we're afraid to make that first commitment to that one person, to say, would you come with me one time, and I'll be there. Not just you go there, I'll pick you up. Try it, you might like it.
Great. I want to add just a couple things and then we're going to break. That you can tell the benefits of your experience within the community, within the Christian community. Because one thing that people are lacking, that when they might believe in Jesus but be spiritual and not religious, is the community. Your experience of community life and worship and the benefits of that, to share that. Also to respect the diversity that people now can really dive into and embrace diversity. Okay, that as you're listening, you may get an earful of very different kinds of beliefs and practices, and being respectful of that is also going to help to form more common ground. Okay, so let's take a break.
Yeah, about 5 more minutes,
Yeah.
and we'll be ready.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Then we'll take questions and discussion. That's what we do. Yes.
I wanted to say, I'm listening to you all, and I'm thinking about your daughter,
Okay.
who probably has the same moral values that you have. I have a sister who's similar. And we discussed this at church a lot, that perhaps we need to be more invitational for socialization with our own congregations in a non-threatening manner, with programs that are non-threatening, so that when they get through those 4 walls, which seems to be threatening to them, they realize that the importance of attending church services or whatever is going on within those 4 walls has to do with relationships with each other. And so when we're invitational to things that are not threatening to them, that brings, we run a senior program out of our church, and so we realize the importance of the socialization aspect of communication between people. And so when you know, one of the worst things we can do within our congregation is address something as a Bible study.
Doesn't strike a chord.
It doesn't strike a chord, especially to someone who is spiritual and not religious.
Okay, so
So,
what kind of non-threatening program might there be? What's out there?
music, art, picnic,
Food?
food.
Free food attracts everybody.
Right.
Except the lime jello. Forget
Those non,
Oh, that's disgusting.
those non-threatening aspects of who we are, to draw them in. Within our congregation, there is an incredible sense of family. And we don't have to talk that talk. But there's that sense when you walk in through the doors of our congregation, you feel your arms being wrapped around someone. And it's not because I'm beating anything on the table.
Mhm.
It's because we truly are very caring and loving. And it's a safe harbor for some people. But
Are you having trouble getting people into the doors for those non-threatening programs?
we really haven't addressed it that fully yet.
Yeah.
If you're going to.
But it's a
Kevin is.
discussion, yeah.
Okay.
It's in the process,
Are you
right?
from the same congregation?
Well,
She and I are.
yeah.
Okay.
If you're gonna invite them in, make sure, number one, you're right, it is a non-threatening situation.
Right.
But make sure they are ready to make that first step and be ready, because it's not gonna happen that first time. Because we just had a lady that stopped in once, she was looking for a church. A month later, she was finally satisfied and gonna join. One of the best ways to get people in a non-threatening, is what Gary's doing here with the concert series. The afternoon you have that piano player, you have that musician come in, then it's open to everybody. And they're gonna feel comfortable, and then they're gonna see what's going on in here, without having to go through the whole religious aspect of it. And then you work them into it, and they will get there.
People have different needs and cravings and desires. And we can't always address all of those, but there's always a sense in all of us of family. Basic family morals and upbringing. And so when people, and we address this with our senior program, we know full well that those people that attend our senior program who are multi-denominational aren't gonna sit in our pews on Sunday. We know that. Forget that paradigm. You know, you're gonna build that field doesn't mean they're gonna play ball there. But what goes on then within those walls at those times that they come is this sense of fellowship and socialization, which is what people crave and they need. They need to touch the humanness of each of us. You know.
I agree.
I wish
Preach
my
it.
daughter was here, because I can't really speak for her. She lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and a few years ago, she went on a mission trip to, I think it was Nicaragua. And I don't know exactly what they did, but they were literally out on the street talking to people.
Yes.
They would just talk to total strangers. My daughter might walk up to somebody and said, "Do you mind if I have a word of prayer with you?" And she said it was remarkable, the response that they got. And it was kind of new to her. And I wish she was here to explain it, but it seems like in this country, we're trying to deal with so many different cultural issues, and it seems as though we have this fear of people or something, or a fear of offending people. I don't know quite how to say it, but it just seems like at some point you gotta just hit it head on.
It's also kind of awkward. I mean, we're not really comfortable. That's outside of my, you know.
Well, there was a
my
comfort zone, right?
Yeah, my
There was a
comfort zone is, it's a little threatening to me, so for me to get out and to talk to a perfect stranger, but I can have relationships with people where I'll say something that will invite conversation, but I can't stand up. I don't think I can, I'd have to be trained to stand on the street corner to do that.
Well, yeah, that's what I said, I wish she was here to say
Yeah,
exactly what they
yeah.
did, but they were right out on the street,
Yeah.
talking to total strangers, inviting them to hear about the gospel. And she came back from that trip very fulfilled. And it was like a very positive experience.
The only way to talk about the gospel is to mention Jesus and the
Right.
gospel,
Right, exactly.
right? So
Exactly.
somehow they got there.
Yeah, they got
They
it.
got there. And maybe that's a lesson to us too, that when you go to strangers, there may not be the barriers that you encounter when you've got folks who have been through some kind of transition away from religion, you know? Yeah.
You think when you are talking or just bumping into somebody and you just simply say, God bless you. You know, if somebody opened the door for you or let you pass or so, and, you know, they turn, well, what do you mean by that? You know, and then it gives you the opportunity then to talk to them. But I know that's, as you said, that relationships, I think, are so important. One of my friends just joined another church because he said he was looking for family that he doesn't have anymore, and looking for that relationship with other people. He's always been spiritual, but he didn't have that structure. And I missed the point of saying, well, come with me. I never knew that he was looking. So that's what I said, you know, you have that opportunity.
We have a structure, an organization, a container in our religion which holds many things, such as family, relationship, values, beliefs, practices, and so on. And if we can connect on spiritual ground with someone, good chance that they believe in God, even a stranger, good chance they believe in God, right, in our culture, and we may not think that from just observing the news and so on,
Right.
you know.
The biggest thing that opened my eyes is I was born Catholic, I was raised as a Catholic. There's 10 kids in my family. I'm Lutheran, my sister is Mormon, my brother is a feel-good church, my other brother is a storefront church. My sister, I really don't know what religion it is, but she's into it. And my niece is a Muslim. And by
Wow.
talking to all these people, you listen to them, and you hear that we're not all that different. There you go. We're not. Not as much as the TV makes you think. And once you talk to people like that, eventually they're gonna come over. Just remember that my way is not always the right way.
Okay? Okay, take a break.
Thank Ann for the first lecture today. And our hospitality ministry has prepared a wonderful fare for all of us. So please help yourselves.
Well, I'm glad you did, because I sit here and it's like, my tongue tied.